So we have a client with a 2-panel MDF door, typical residential 2868, 21068, something in that range. And this happens to be the door, I believe, to a room, like what would be typically in a basement, but you're going to have inside of there some equipment that needs fresh air, a fresh air intake, water tank, HVAC, things of that nature. So the client wants to provide that source of fresh air for that equipment, and there's the one way to do it is some people will literally just take a circular saw and cut an inch off the bottom of the door. Some people will do that, and if you sooner or later you may notice that. Why they have an excessive undercut? It's because of a fresh air intake. You won't see it in many applications because you can't exceed a dimension from the bottom of the door to the sill if it's a fire door. In residential applications, less of a concern. You'll also solve the problem by simply installing a louvered door. However, sometimes people start out with inheriting a application where there's not a louvered door that's there, and they need to provide that intake. They don't want to cut off a lot off the bottom of the door. And they don't want to, another way to do it actually is to, what I was going to say was the other way that some people do it, they'll actually create a return grill somewhere in a wall where a source of fresh air can be achieved from. So that's another way that it's been done. The cutting of the door down, that's pretty easy. You have to be mindful of compromising the integrity of the door when you do that. You might cut into something. You might cut something off. There may not be enough wood there to begin with to do that. You might cut into a lag bolt or a nail that's in there for some unusual reason. If it's lumber, you might hit a gum pocket, or you might, have some sort of a problem with a knot. So trimming the door down is not always the way to go, but nonetheless, it is an inexpensive way to accomplish this. And it may not matter. Your basement may be of such a situation where the door can't be really ever seen, and whether it's a 1/2 inch or a 3/4 undercut or 1 3/4 just isn't going to matter. The return register grill usually doesn't work out. Putting a louver into the door, if you can't get a full louver door to begin with, which is maybe material-wise less expensive than buying a louver kit, the overall cost is not going to be less expensive usually, because you have to mortise it, you have to hang it, you'll have to paint it. Whereas with a louver kit, you kind of have to paint that, possibly, or finish it somehow. And once you get the hole cut in the door, you're in pretty good shape. So the question becomes, or has been, how to prep this door for that louver. So let's talk about how we're going to do that. I'll switch to the screen view to do so. If you are enjoying this video, please click thumbs up or like, and also please consider subscribing to our channel. Let's move on to the rest of the video. And what we have here is the client's application, and the client has provided me the net door cutout size, or what will be the net door cutout size. And that's what the louvers will be made to. The client has approximately 22 1/4 wide and 26 high. So that'll be the cutout, something in that range. So the question becomes is how best to do it, and the client has, stated that they have experience as a locksmith and therefore has a certain level of comfort with tools. Circular saw or a hole saw, a circular saw or a jigsaw or a router. And if the question is what is the best way to do it, the best way is not the fastest, but the best way is a router. And how I would go about doing this would depend on how many I had to do. If I had one to do, I might find myself lazy. If I had more than one to do, I would absolutely make a template first. So this door is going to have to come off the jamb. The hardware will have to be removed. The passage set, the hinges. I would lay this door down flat on sawhorses. Before I got to doing anything, I would take a piece of 3/4 plywood and I would cut it to the exact width of the door, and I would cut it up to about here is what I would do. whatever the bottom rail dimension is, I would duplicate that up here. And I would have a piece of plywood that I could lay over the door. But before I've laid the plywood onto the door, which is now going to be my template, I'm going to make a preparation inside of that plywood template, the exact size I need to achieve my net door cutout size at the proper dimension from the bottom of the door and from one side of the door. You don't really have to make it the net size of the door. You could make it wider, but that's what you're going to need. So prepping the door to receive a louver is the same as making a template. But when I'm making a template, I would figure out what my net width and net height need to be in that template and where I'm locating it from the bottom and over from the side. And I would drill 4 small holes in each of those corners. I would then put a straight edge on the piece of plywood itself, and I would personally drill that hole large enough, like a 1-inch hole, such that the outside of the radius or the outside circumference of the hole did not get further out than where I needed it to be, so I could drop a plunge router bit on a 2.5 horsepower plunge router, Bosch, Porter cable, whoever you want, and I would plunge route that. You'd have to make multiple passes because plywood's tough to cut, and you're going to need a way to dead stop that router when it hits where you want to stop. And I would do that on all 4 sides. Now, having said that, that operation is the same as doing it to the door itself. The reason that you want to take your time and not do it to the door itself is you would like to not have to paint this door when you're done. And if you do multiple setups, 4 setups on here to cut with a router, with having things clamped down to the face of the door, surely you're going to need to paint the door. So I would suggest that you make a template that you can then put butcher paper down to the door. Wax paper might be okay as well. Whatever you've got. I wouldn't put newsprint, anything with pigment in it. I would put painter's, paper down. And I would tape that with painter's tape. I would tape it down so that when I put my template down and then I clamped it with my quick release clamps, all I would have to do is drop my router in and get to work. And this will cut easy because this is just MDF. Now, speaking of cutting it, where are you going to cut it? Don't cut it in the house. This is going to make an awful mess. And in fact, I wouldn't cut it in the garage. I'd cut it outside in a backyard. And I would have someone with me who's holding a good quality wet dry vac, that they're holding the nozzle right at the source of where all the particulate's being created. If you wanted to get super fancy, you could have someone at the top and bottom of the door collecting that, because you really don't want that going everywhere. It's going to be millions of particulate that are then going to be floating around, worst of all, in your lungs. So now, how to achieve that size in the template if that's the route you're going to go? Well, what you have to consider is the relationship between the net size that you have to accomplish and how much bigger the cutout in the template has to be to achieve that. And I'm going to pull up a manufacturer called Sauce. They're known for invisible hinges, and there's documentation here that will help me illustrate what needs to happen. Let's do this. Plunge router base. So you've got a plunge router base here. Let's just do images. No, let's do this. Okay, we've got this plunge router base that's here, and the diameter of the base is going to be some certain dimension, whatever it's going to be. Whatever the diameter is, it really doesn't matter. What matters is the guide that you're going to install into the base, as well as the diameter of the router bit. Because if this base is, say, 5-inch diameter or 6-inch in diameter, let's say the center line is, well, let's say 8-inch. The center line is 4-inch. If the OD of your guide is 5/8, you've got to deduct half of that value. Well, you've got to deduct the value of when you are putting the router onto the template so that the hole in the template is larger than what you need to achieve. And that's going to be based on, as I said, the diameter of the guide and the diameter of the bit. So the sauce catalog does a pretty good job talking about this. So there is a guide that they have which has a 3/4 inch diameter. Into that OD, that 3/4 inch, you're going to use a 1/2-inch diameter 2-flute carbide plunge router bit is what you're going to end up using. But you might start to think to yourself, what's actually more important is the guide bushing ID along with the diameter of the bit. So if you've got 21/32 on the ID of this, the inside dimension, and you've got a 1/2-inch bit, 1 divided by 32 times 21, that's going to be 0.656. Well, minus 0.5, that's going to leave you with roughly 5/32. And you divide that by 2 because you're going to lose that amount of room on either side. You've got a certain dimension that you're going to need to calculate. So the size that you're going to end up achieving is going to be based on the OD, the ID, and the bit diameter of what you're working with. But for our purposes, it's really the OD and the bit diameter. So if we've got a 1/2-inch bit going into a 3/4 inch OD, well, that's 1/8 of an inch all the way around, or on either side. You can think of that. So you will need to adjust that template based on that 1/8 of an inch. So wherever your line needs to be, it's going to be that center line, 1/2 of 3/4 is 3/8, minus that 1/8 of an inch that you're going to have inside of there. And that's what you're going to need to prep to in order to get that hole exactly where you need it to be. That would be my approach. And this is important in the sauce catalog because in this area they are talking about their templates. So what happens with their templates is the hole size in the template is going to be larger than the size that the hinge requires. So the overall length and the overall width of the prep in the template for the hinge is larger than the dimensions we were talking about earlier, is the bottom line. So let's discuss this concept a little bit further in terms of how exactly you'll go about creating the prep in the template, using the sauce information or the sauce material as a guide. So let's switch back to the camera view. If you've not hit subscribe yet, we would very much appreciate if you did, and hopefully you're enjoying this video. Now, let's get back to it. So let's study this relationship a little bit more, and as a way to do that would be to have some examples. So we talked earlier about the 3/4 inch OD of the guide, and then the 1/2 inch bit that's going through there, and the fact that there's an 1/8 of an inch all the way around. Maybe more simply initially thought of as an 1/8 inch here, and an 1/8 inch here, 1/2 inch in the middle. All of that together will equal 3/4. So, to prove the point that we've got to think about that 1/8 inch, I've got a sauce 218. This happens to be an IC version. The width of the faceplate is 1.1 inches. Okay. So we know we've got an 1.1 inches. Now, let's pull out the template. Here's a 218 IT template. So this sucker is going to meant to go right inside of there when it's all said and done. Now, if I were to measure the inside width of this template, we might be enlightened as to what that dimension is. So that is 1 3/8. Well, okay, so that's a 1/4 inch bigger than the width of the face of the hinge. And that tells me that that's where that 1/8 of an inch on either side comes into play. So use that relationship when you are trying to figure out what that hole prep needs to be. So in our instance, it's going to be net cutout size plus what you're going to lose between the OD of the guide and the OD of the router bit divided by 2, meaning on either side. So because you're going to work this template off of a center line, you're going to need to go, so I think the dimension was 22 1/4 is the cutout size. So you're going to take half of that and then add your 1/8 inch. Well, actually what you're going to end up adding is the collet diameter, something like this. I would take my guide diameter, I would subtract my router bit diameter, and I would divide both of that by 2. That would give me a net result. Whatever in our instance, it's 3/4 and 1/2 inch divided by 2 is 1/8 inch. Off of the center line of my template, I know that I need 22 1/4. Okay, so I'm going to add that dimension because of the, thinking of it in terms of half of the guide, 3/8 is the guide diameter, but then we're going to have half of the bit diameter of 1/4 inch. 3/8, if we're thinking about half of the guide, 3/8 minus 1/4 is going to be 1/8 of an inch. So of the 3/8 that you would need to shift the router over, 1/2 of an inch of it is going to be consumed, pardon me, 1/4 inch of it is going to be consumed by the router, half of the diameter of the router encroaching into that space. Remember the first time I made a template, and when I tested it on a call door, I realized, whoa, my math is off. My cutout is too large. And so it's going to be template, thinking of your center line, so 11 1/8, 22 1/4 divided by 2 is 11 1/8, add 1/8 of an inch. Center line, 11 1/8 plus 1/8 inch is 11 1/4, right? Something like that. 22 1/4, 11 1/8, so 11 1/4 this way. So we know that that cutout is going to be an overall amount of 1/4 inch larger than what you're going to need to achieve. It's a bit counterintuitive because you've got that guide and then the router bit going through it. If you just were putting the guide there, you'd have to make it half of the guide diameter, but you're going to eat into it because the router bit's encroaching into that space, leaving you with just the 1/8 of an inch. So don't use that math for what to do, but use the logic for figuring out what to do, and test before you do anything on a call door. I could be wrong for your application. I could be wrong for my application. You always test when it comes to woodworking. You want to make sure that what you're going to achieve is going to work out just dandy. Now, cutting out that panel door, circular saw, that's no good. Circular saw blade is round. You're going to be able to stop really well at the top, but then the bottom, you're not going to be close enough. You're going to be 1 inch or 2 away. You don't want that. You want this to be clean. You want it to be perfect, and you want it to be one time. And if you had more than one to do, you've made a template. Now what you can do, and I had said earlier, make the template the actual width of the door. So all you have to do is square it off to the bottom of the door, clamp it down here, and then have at it quickly. If you've got a large project to do, what you're able to do with the template and with the plunge router is you're able to ritualize the process. You can show 3 people one time how to do it, and you've got 80 doors to do. You'll have that work done really quickly. The bonus of collecting it with the wet dry vac is just to keep the particulate out of the air and, more importantly, out of your lungs. That's how I would end up doing it. I've done it, you can do it with a hammer and chisel. It's just, if you're going to change spark plugs, a spark plug socket is a better tool than a toothbrush. So, you can do it with either. It's just one is a more appropriate way to do it, and in my opinion, it would be a router. A router and a caliper is the and a combination square. Those are the carpenter's best friends, best tools. Any questions on how to go about doing this, please feel free to reach out to us. My name is Rich Howard, owner of Architectural Builders Supply. Thank you. Again, thank you for watching, and if you've enjoyed this video, please click thumbs up. Please subscribe and maybe even send the video to someone that you know. Thank you.